Hello. Um, I'm here to give this week's virtual lecture for EURO 2200. I hope I've got a few people that are watching. Since I know I've given back the midterm grades, you might be all ghosting me. Anyway, the topic, you've probably noticed, maybe I pointed it out already, that the topic for this week, or the theme for this week, I've called the new spiritualism. And I think I pointed out, how close can I get here? All these themes along here. Each week we've had a different theme that I've tried to adhere to, because the subject of the course is gender and modernism in Europe from 1848 to 1920. But the subject of gender and modernism, both of these terms, are really quite tricky to define. There's no kind of blanket statement. The word modernism, for instance, was used, I believe, first by the Romans, who used it as a term to distinguish themselves from their predecessors, which were the Greeks. That was 2,000 years ago, and to think that the Romans were modern, if you told somebody that, you'd be laughed out of the room. In any case, the many people that we're looking at in this course, artists, writers, and so on, also considered themselves modern. They called their work modern. And so we are, the purpose is to figure out what exactly they mean by that, because it's a term that meant different things to different people. And sorry, I'm also going to take a drink. In particular, we're going to finish the class, the last couple of weeks, by examining this really new thing that happened in literature and mostly visual art that's called abstraction. And we'll focus on artists artists that belong to this group called the Blue Rider, that was focused in Munich. And, members of that group were people like Wassily Kandinsky, Franz Marc, Paul Klee, Alexei Yaolenski, Gabriela Munter. We'll look at works by those artists, and we'll read about what they considered abstract and what their discoveries were. Because according to, I would say, 90% of scholars, there's a kind of standard story that has been woven for decades, really, that modernism was founded in Munich by that group, by the Blue Rider. And, that Kandinsky is the father of modernism. He's certainly been called the father of abstraction. So has Franz Marc. And scholars have spent years going through their correspondence, reconstructing their conversations, reconstructing their exhibitions. The place that I used to work at in Munich, called the Städtische Galerie im Lembachhaus, that was a whole institution that was devoted to that group, and still is, for the most part. But what I'm going to talk about today are a couple of women who upset that narrative and who challenged that story. And their work has only come to light in the last 20 years. And it's quite remarkable that we have these two examples. And in fact, it turns out there's several more. Both of them were members of larger groups that were doing similar things. 10, 20 years before Kandinsky discovered abstraction. So the people that, and I should say too, we'll hear a couple of presentations by students on Friday about Georgiana Houghton and Hilma af Klint. Klint, let me point out, is spelt Klint, not Gustav Klimt that I spoke about from Vienna the Friday before the reading break. So these two women, Georgiana Houghton, Hilma af Klimt, they lived in different countries. They were, I think Georgiana Houghton was a little bit older than Hilma af Klimt. The sort of apex of her work happened in, I think it's, I want to say, 1871. With Klint, it's 1906, 07, 08. But they were both involved in something called spiritualism. They both conducted seances or participated in seances. They both made efforts to communicate through these seances with some kind of other alternate world that lay beyond what we perceive as reality, as our everyday world. Already having said that R word, I think about the conversations I had, about with the midterm and reality being only what Gustave Courbet meant, namely the depiction of the working classes. Here I'm talking about it, just our everyday, what's perceptible. And both of these women, Houghton and af Klint, like I said, participated in seances to try to extend beyond everyday life. They were, or what was perceptible. They were in search of kind of like the realm where supposed ghosts lived. In the example of Georgiana Houghton, she was specifically wanted to get in touch with a sister of hers who had passed away. The death of her sister kind of prompted her to get involved in this practice and to learn how to conduct seances. And it's through that, those new skills, if you want to call them that, that she was prompted, apparently, as she tells the story, from one of the spirits. I think they had a name. Was it Lenny? You can see my Moritz in the background. Anyway, she was prompted by one of the spirits to take up drawing, and she created something like 155 images. They're very small, tiny, tiny little works in color that involve paint, white drawings, white ink, paint ink drawing, pencil drawings. And there were roughly, like I said, 155 of them that resulted from these seances that she was having. I should say, too, that Georgiana Houghton conducted so many seances that she became well known as is the word clairvoyant or spiritualist. And she was apparently occasionally hired by Sherlock Holmes to help in his investigations. That's how involved she became in these works. And she is the person, I think I passed around this book on Monday. So she's on the cover of this book, and I'll pass it around again let me see if there's a page. Here's a lovely, lovely, look at that. Everything else, here's another one. Became well known as a clairvoyant, in London and created these 155 drawings, which we, who do I mean by we, viewers from today, would call abstract. Now, the tricky thing is whether we could really call them art. They are the result of these spiritualist activities, and they definitely predate the works of Kandinsky or other great fathers of modernism, so the story of art tells us. So they're super interesting. It is, however, really unlikely that she would have called them abstract art. I don't think she was familiar with the term abstraction. She did exhibit her drawings very briefly in 1871 in London at something called the New British Art Gallery. Critics wrote about it, wrote about the show, mostly in disparaging terms, because if you think about it, they really were not ready for abstraction. What does that mean? And in order to have a paradigm shift like that, I think it takes a lot of preparation with the public, a lot of support and what we call today programming to kind of explain the new, a very new kind of work that might not otherwise be recognized as art. It might be dismissed. I think in her case, it was dismissed as eccentric, amateurish. It was called most astonishing and perhaps the most devastating description, a gallery of painful absurdities. Those are some of the things that were said about her drawings. Houghton died in 1884. She wasn't known as an artist to begin with, and perhaps for that reason, almost all of her drawings and works were lost to history. There are lots of scholars who keep hoping that they're going to turn up somewhere. Have a look in your attics. Maybe your grandparents accidentally bought them at a garage sale. Wouldn't that be amazing? You'd be a millionaire if that happened. In any case, I think it's, no, I'm not sure when. At some point, I think it was, before 2016, 22 of her drawings showed up unexpectedly in Australia. And they were exhibited and considered, and then they were sent to sort of the center of all art historical knowledge, at least in the English-speaking world, which is called the Courtauld Institute in London. And they had an exhibition of her work there in 2016, where this question was asked, can we consider them art? The question was pretty much a rhetorical question. There was no definitive answer. It's kind of tricky. Like I said, she wasn't a self-declared artist. She really attributed the drawings to the work of this spirit who was working through her. So it's kind of, it's an awkward thing to really consider them in the history of art. But they're part of the history. I guess what you could say is that the spiritualist movement at the end of the 19th century it wasn't restricted to Europe, but in North America, and mostly in aristocratic circles. was gaining a lot of traction at that time, and it definitely had a visual component. There's a lot of really interesting, the connection between this spiritualists and photography is really fascinating. There's been a lot of interesting exhibitions about how spiritualists manipulated photography at the time to make it look like people were sitting with their with relatives that had passed on, as if those relatives were suddenly present in a family portrait as ghosts. And Georgiana Houghton, when her drawings sort of weren't a raving success, also embraced photography. We're not looking at that in terms of in this class. However, another practitioner, another member of the spiritualist movement, is this other woman in Sweden called Hilma af Klint. She was, like I said, a little bit younger than Georgiana Houghton. She was working in, I think it was Stockholm. She also belonged to an aristocratic family. She was an adherent to a school of spiritualism called Theosophy. Now we're going to hear a bit more about Theosophy in a few weeks when we return to this question of abstraction. And we hear about how Kandinsky, this Russian-German artist, was really a follower of Theosophy. He read all of the, there were two writers in particular that influenced him, Rudolf Steiner and somebody called Madame Blavatsky. I have a hard time pronouncing her name. Blavatsky, maybe. Anyway, I'll get it by the time I teach the class. In any case, this artist Hilma af Klint was an adherent to. She was a member of a group of women that conducted seances, and was also guided by her spiritual guide. His or her name was Amaliel, and he or she also led her to create now quite a different, also abstract. Instead of being tiny little works in small format, these are massive, large format paintings. I've put several of them on your course link for this week. I've also put a link to Georgiana Houghton's website. If you click on exhibitions, you can see some, I think there aren't a lot of illustrations there, but the best ones are under exhibitions. For Hilma af Klint, I've put a page with some images, not just of her works, but also her works in front of viewers, so you can see how large they are. I seem to think I put another link. Oh, I know what I put one special image by Georgiana Houghton. I'll come back to that. Anyways, Klint, as I said, was a member of this group of women who were privately painting. They weren't exhibiting any of their works. And painting only after they had conducted these seances. They were looking for some kind of universal truth, some kind of imagery that would unlock another world. Was that kind of like, can we call it escapism? This, like I said, not just the format is different compared with Georgiana Houghton, but also the visual language. We have a lot of geometric shapes, not so many like wild open swirls and feathery shapes like like we do in with Houghton, but more geometric shapes, large kind of color fields. Oh, I have a visitor on the table. You gonna stay over there? Yeah, much larger geometric shapes. And her kind of interest was in, here's this magic word, dualism. And she wanted to overcome dualism through the union of different elements, the union of antithetical elements. And so it's one of the, I'm sure that one can spend a lot of time deciphering her visual language. And I would discourage you to do that, because that is a rabbit hole. I think, I'm not sure you want to fall down unless you want to write a master's thesis, which I'm sure people have done before. But just on a very superficial level, to observe that she does often have two kind of larger shapes, larger elements that are almost, subsuming each other, that are flowing into each other. And that does reflect this effort to depict some kind of a union of sorts. I guess I should have said too. I mentioned that this is now, in both cases, we're looking at an abstract language. Another word that we could use is non-figurative. There are no figures. We can't really recognize much of anything. I think there are a couple of swans in Houghton's, in Klint's works, but they're predominantly things we don't recognize, just colors and just shapes. And that is a radically new language, a visual language that Kandinsky is going to talk a lot more about. Kandinsky really, one of the reasons probably that he was credited with the discovery of abstraction was that he was such a good showman, really, about it. He had developed the language to talk about it. He developed a new vocabulary that he was using, and these women had not. They were really painting in silence. Klint did not exhibit her works ever. In fact, and I can tell you a little bit about that. She, in fact, invited one of the people who was one of the spiritualists in this movement called Theosophy, called Rudolf Steiner, who made the trip up. I want to say he was originally in Vienna, but I'll have to look that up. Maybe he was Swiss. Anyway, he traveled up to Stockholm to visit her. She invited him, and he actually went. And much to her disappointment, he did not kind of like what he saw with her work. He kind of discouraged her and said, you don't want to be exhibiting this stuff, and you're going to have to. The world. He predicted that the world would only be ready in about 50 years after he had seen it, which of course must have been quite devastating to her. Luckily, she did keep working, but she never exhibited her work. She's credited with completing about 1,000 works. There's a multi-volume set of catalogs which document her work. Don't know if it's in the McLaughlin Library. I'm sure it would be at the AGO library. But perhaps also in keeping with her, with that blow from Steiner, she stipulated in her will that she didn't want her works exhibited at least until 20 years after she had died. That kind of speaks to somebody who's not very confident about their work. I mean, she should have ignored his advice and just gone ahead and exhibited it. Who knows what? The story of art might have been quite different, because her visual language definitely predated that of Kandinsky's and other members of the Blue Rider by several years. I think the apex or the zenith of that, of her work, I think this 10 paintings, actually, they're called the 10 largest. So those works that are on the course link file, those were finished in 1906, 1907, 1908. And Kandinsky really achieved abstraction 1910, 1911, around there. So it's quite a big difference. But like I said, also a difference in how those artists were presenting themselves to the world. That's unfortunately part of the game. You have to be a bit of a showman and be able to present your work as well as simply doing it. It's kind of unfortunate. Couple other things to say about those large canvases by Klint. You'll see they contain spirals, geometric shapes, florals, lots of color symbolism, and she had this idea that those 10 works in particular were supposed to symbolize various phases in the life of man. And she is quoted as saying she wanted to give the world a glimpse of the system of the parts of the life of man. They are childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age. So those 10 works in particular are really noteworthy. And you know what? Let's just go down. I don't think this is, excuse me. Those 10 works are really noteworthy for her achievement. I think that's almost all I want to say about those two women, those two artists. Just that, they have their work and a couple of other people. There's Emma Kunz, who I don't know very much about, but someone's doing a presentation, so I look forward to learning. But there were also a couple of women involved with Georgiana Houghton, I believe, who were also kind of creating visual work. And it's definitely a interesting thing to consider, why they didn't become the mothers of abstraction rather than Kandinsky being the father of abstraction. That very much, feeds into a feminist narrative of, patriarchal forces working in the history of art, which in this case, you definitely cannot deny. I guess the final thing I want to mention has to do with this interest by Hilma af Klint in the overcoming of dualism. I think that's really an interesting notion, given that we've also kind of encountered that theme in other works in this course. Remember, I think I mentioned it with Moreau's Oedipus and the Sphinx, and certainly with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's the transformation of the gentleman scientist into the monstrous brute. And those passages that the author of that book, Robert Louis Stevenson, said about the dual nature of mankind, about how man is in conflict, basically. With that in mind, I thought I would bring your attention to an image by Houghton that I find super interesting. It's from 1862. It is on your course link. And it is by Georgiana Houghton. And it's called The Portrait of the Lord Jesus Christ. I think that is just fascinating. I used to, before for several, weeks, I would flip through this book and flip through that image and just find it strange and keep flipping past until I read that title, The Portrait of Jesus Christ. This is obviously quite a unconventional portrait of Christ from 1862. And I can't help thinking that this is also an effort to overcome dualism in terms of gender, and to find some kind of image, which Houghton is obviously connecting with Christian Savior, that brings together both sexes. That looks like a very some kind of figure that has both male and female components in them. Most of her drawings have notes on the back. I would love to read the notes for that particular drawing and to see what exactly was intended, because I don't think I've quite ever seen a portrait of Jesus that looks like that, especially from 1862. I'll bring this book back on Friday, and we'll have presentations from 2 students, and then talk a little bit about another, a German woman by the name of Lou Andreas Salome. So have a great day. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching right till the end. And I'll see you soon. Bye.